It is my privilege this morning to introduce someone who probably needs no introduction for most of us, the Reverend Dr. Leanna K. Fuller. Joan Marshall, Associate Professor of Pastoral Care. She got her MDiv at Vanderbilt Divinity School and her PhD, also Vanderbilt University, in religion, psychology, and culture. Her areas of specialty, for those of you who don't know her, are pastoral care and counseling, pastoral theology, death, dying, and grief, and I'm landing on the congregational conflict piece, since I suspect we'll hear more about that than anything else today. And that leads neatly to her books, When Christ's Body is Broken, Anxiety, Identity, and Conflict in Congregations. We have copies back there for sale, $15 cash only. And then her newest, which sadly did not arrive in time to be on that back table, but Embodied Reconciliation. It was out yesterday. You can get the book, and I'm sure she will tell us more about it today. So that was published this year, literally out yesterday. I also wanted to put in a plug for her new Demon program, Bridging Divides, Church, Community, and Country, and there are more of these out on that front table if you're interested. So with that, let us welcome the Reverend Dr. Leanna K. Fuller.
Thank you so much, Becky, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here today. It is a special joy and privilege for me to have been invited to spend some time with you in this setting, talking with you about a topic that is especially close to my heart, both as a scholar and as a pastor. As Becky said, and I think as many of you may know, much of my scholarly work over the years has been focused on various aspects of conflict in faith communities, what its origins are, how it develops, and how leaders might best handle it. More recently, though, I've become increasingly interested in what happens in faith communities after an intense conflict has occurred. What are the tasks of leadership and care in such circumstances? How might communities heal from these kinds of conflicts? And what might that healing look like? What might reconciliation look like? And what are the specific communal practices that might help healing and reconciliation to take root? It's this last question about the communal practices that can help congregations move toward healing and reconciliation that I'll be focusing on in my presentation today. As it happens, as Becky shared, just yesterday, I released a book on this topic, and much of what I share with you today grows out of the research and writing I did to produce the book. The book's title is similar to the title of my talk today. The book title is Embodied Reconciliation, Congregational Healing as Pastoral Care. And as Becky mentioned, we didn't get the copies here in time to sell. I think they're coming today, so not quite in time for this morning. But there are flyers back there with a QR code that will allow you to order directly from the publisher. You can also order it from whatever your preferred bookseller is. And I did tape one flyer down on the table so that if, for some reason, when you get there, all the flyers have been taken, you can still scan the one that's on the table. So just wanted to make that as easy as possible for you if you have interest. So the book is structured around 4 main areas of communal practice that I believe can help communities heal from conflict and tension. And that'll be the 4 that I talk about today and focus on this morning. But before I jump into describing these 4 areas, I think it's important to offer a caveat. And that is that talking about communal reconciliation is often much more complex than individual reconciliation. Because in communal reconciliation, there's really no one victim or perpetrator. What I mean is that in a case where one individual has clearly been harmed by another, it seems pretty obvious which person needs to ask forgiveness and which person has the ability to grant that request or not. But in situations of communal discord or conflict, we may all have hurt or been hurt by each other. So that means it's not so simple to figure out just how to pursue forgiveness and reconciliation with one another. I'm hoping that these practices that I'm going to introduce you to today may help with that. So I've put them up here on this slide just to kind of help us give an overview, and then I'll walk through some details of it. But as you see here, the 4 areas of practice that I'm suggesting and that I talk about in the book are truth-telling, grieving and lamenting, confessing and repenting, and blessing and releasing. What I would like to do in this talk today is to go into a bit more detail about each of these areas and provide some specific examples of what those might look like in practice. So let's start with truth-telling. As a precursor to writing my most recent book, I did a lot of research into the topic of reconciliation. As part of that research, I explored literature related to international conflict resolution. Think about places like South Africa or Northern Ireland to get a sense of the types of conflicts I'm talking about. One of the most prominent themes I've found in that literature is that truth-telling is a critically important step along the path to reconciliation. Quite simply, relationships cannot fully heal apart from the truth. Now, needless to say, I hope, the kinds of disagreements we typically have in congregations do not rise to the level of international crisis. But I do think the literature that came out of those conflicts can be very instructive for us as we think about what it might take to start practicing reconciliation in our own communities. And I think practices of truth-telling, in particular, have an important role to play in this process. I would suggest that when a community of faith is trying to heal from a divisive conflict, 2 kinds of truth-telling are necessary. The first is telling the truth about what happened, and the second is telling the truth about difference. So let's talk first about telling the truth about what happened. In the Book of Forgiving, the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter Mfo Tutu write, "The truth prevents us from pretending that the things that happened did not happen. How we begin is by first letting the truth be heard in all its rawness, in all its ugliness, and in all its messiness." For faith communities that have endured an intense conflict, an important first step toward healing involves creating a space for people to talk about what happened. Now, often people in churches and other organizations think that talking about something painful leads to dwelling in hurt in an unhealthy way. Instead, they think we should just move on and look toward the future rather than the past. But I believe that if people do not find a way to tell the truth about their communal pain, whatever caused that pain will continue to exert power over their relationships and cause them to become stuck in feelings of anger, resentment, or bitterness. Then, ironically, they will find themselves unable to move forward in exactly the ways that they first feared. So, of course, there are lots of ways to create space in a community for this kind of truth-telling. And I should also say that this is the kind of practice that leaders may need some help with, because there is a way in which inviting people to tell their story around communal pain, it can go to a place that's not helpful. It can go to a place of people just rehearsing over and over difficult events, which can actually re-traumatize people. So I'm not saying that we should just kind of make it a free-for-all and not have any structure to it. And so some leaders may feel that they need some assistance with thinking through how to do that. And in the book, I did publish at the end of the book an appendix that I called Levels of Practice, where I kind of say, like, here are the kinds of practices I think most leaders can probably do on their own without a whole lot of assistance. Here are some where they might need some coaching, and here are some where maybe they need to bring in a professional. And I think this kind of sharing of communal pain, depending on the qualifications and how the leader's equipped, maybe the leader can do it on their own, but they might need some coaching or additional training to do this. But I would suggest to you that one of the most important aspects of creating a space for this kind of truth-telling, whether it's in a church or really any setting, is setting ground rules for conversation and asking all participants to agree to abide by them. I do this every semester on the first day of class. We talk about what are the expectations here in the classroom for how we're going to interact with each other. And I ask students to contribute their own ideas for what they would like to see in our expectations together. A congregational consultant and writer who's published a lot on church conflict, Speed Lees, offers the following as examples of ground rules that a particular group might establish to structure their conversations together. And these are just an excerpt of the ones that he suggests. I'm just providing these as examples. The first is to use personal statements, I, my, and our, rather than blaming or attacking language, you, your. It seems like a small difference, but it makes a big difference in how people receive what's being said. Another one you can see there is describing feelings rather than acting them out or attempting to disguise them. So obviously this may take a certain level of emotional maturity and emotional intelligence that maybe not everyone has. But the more that we can actually give voice to the feelings that we're experiencing rather than sort of embodying them in a reactive way or trying to stuff them down and pretending like they're not there, the more honesty and transparency we can create in the group. So I remember many years ago now, my field education supervisor said to me, one of the most important things I ever learned in ministry was how to say, I'm getting angry. You know, so he said like it was important for him to name when he was starting to feel anger rather than waiting until the anger was so great that he said something he would regret or lash out at someone destructively. So being able to describe how we're feeling and talk about it. Another one that Speed Lees suggests is, as much as possible, stay with descriptions of behavior rather than guesses at what that behavior means. Now, this is really hard because as humans, we sort of naturally interpret what others are doing all the time, right? And we often, even without knowing it, assign motivation to them. But the truth is we can't really know what someone else's motivation is when they're doing or saying something. All we can do, I think, honestly, is to say, I notice that you are saying X or that you are doing Y. Here is how I'm feeling in response to that. Can you share with me what you're thinking or what your motivations are here? And that's a very different kind of question or response than, well, obviously you're angry, or you did that because you want me to feel this. And it's a very different approach. It's more about born of curiosity rather than assumption. But one thing I will say, Speed Lees doesn't really address this in this particular part of his book, I don't think. But being able to do that, to stay with description of behavior rather than assuming motivation, also usually requires that the person listening be present to themselves and not allow themselves to get caught up in emotion. That's usually when we become reactive, right? When we stop pausing and thinking and wondering, and instead just kind of react or have the automatic response. That typically is not as helpful. And then this last one perhaps doesn't need to be said, but make no threats. So hopefully in most congregations, people are not threatening physical violence. I mean, it does happen, but I think in churches, what we see much more commonly is threats like, well, if we don't do this the way that I want to do it, I'm leaving, right? Or I'm going to stop giving. So one way to help sort of curb that kind of behavior, which is really not helpful, is if everyone agrees from the beginning, here's our ground rules, here's what we're going to agree to together. Now, it doesn't mean people still won't do these things sometimes, but at least it helps for the group to talk about these things. And I believe if the group is actually involved in making the ground rules, they're more likely to abide by them, rather than feeling like, oh, you're giving me a set of rules that I have to abide by. Instead, it's more like, let's figure this out together. But the thing is, as I was saying, sometimes people do break the ground rules. And ground rules, unfortunately, are not very effective unless community members are willing to hold each other accountable to them. Or the group designates a leader or facilitator whose role is to help enforce ground rules. Now, in a congregational setting, this can be tricky because if you just designate the pastor as the one who's enforcing the ground rules, that can create tricky dynamics because this pastor is also the pastoral caregiver for this whole group. So I think a group needs to think carefully about how would this work best. Personally, I think the ideal is for everybody to take responsibility for holding the ground rules, right? So I think it's just as effective for another person in the group to say, hey, so-and-so, we agreed that we were not going to make threats, right? And what you said just now, to me, sounded like a threat. So like that is a way of kind of checking each other. But I admit that this is something that, at least in my experience, congregations are not great at. Like, people don't typically feel that comfortable saying that kind of thing so directly to each other. And it can feel really uncomfortable, especially if this is not the culture of that place, to be so direct and hold each other accountable in these ways. For that reason, some congregations, if you're imagining having some sort of process where you want to institute ground rules, some congregations might need to engage in some training opportunities, maybe related to communication or boundary setting, before they could effectively name and enforce appropriate ground rules. So as you can see, what I'm describing are things that take time. And this is one of the reasons I think many congregations have conflicts that kind of get out of hand, because people often want to jump to parts of the process that in their mind will make a decision or settle, an issue. Whereas I actually think the more important an issue is in the life of the group, the longer runway you need to be able to deal with it in a healthy way. And things like this, getting a little training, setting up ground rules, these are all like pre-steps to actually having a conversation. But ultimately, setting expectations for group communication and holding community members accountable to them, I think, is critical for the process of negotiating differences and healing from conflict. Just quite frankly, if people do not feel emotionally and psychologically safe in a group, you will not hear from them, period. In the church that I served, they went through a huge conflict. The senior pastor and I, we didn't really know what we were doing, so we would have these meetings where we thought the idea was to get people's ideas on the table, have them have conversation, but what happened, as you could probably predict, is the people who were the most extreme on either side did all the talking, very little listening. People were kind of just exchanging, diatribes back and forth, and there was a huge swath of people in the middle that never said a word. And who could blame them? Because they're watching this and they're thinking, I don't want to stand up and say something and get attacked, So that just wasn't a good way to approach that. And I think if we could have, one, had ground rules from the beginning that were clear, but also had smaller groups for people to talk in, that would have been much more effective. Because people could have shared, even people who didn't feel comfortable speaking in front of 50 other people, they could have shared their thoughts in a smaller group, and that could have been captured somehow. So we can talk more about that later if you all would like to. So that's a little, just a little slice of thinking about telling the truth about what happened. So trying to help people process what's gone on, share their experiences, share their feelings about it. But another part of truth-telling is telling the truth about difference. So if your community, and I think this happens a lot, if your community is not necessarily struggling to heal from a specific conflict, okay, but instead it's just been experiencing a more general sense of divisiveness or polarization that doesn't really seem focused on one thing, but seems to be affecting the relationships and decision-making structures of the church, here this different type of truth-telling might be in order. So instead of telling the truth about a particular incident, congregations might begin to move toward healing by telling the truth about difference. And what I mean by this is pretty simple. It's just acknowledging the differences that always exist within any group of people. This is important because it helps us understand more clearly the diversity in our midst, rather than assuming we're all the same. Now, we know from research that's out there that from a political standpoint, congregations are becoming more homogenous, right? So like, there are such things as purple congregations, but they're not as common as they used to be. But that political piece is only one type of difference, right? Even in a group that politically is pretty homogenous, or even racially homogenous, there's probably lots of other kinds of difference that are there that are just not as easily visible. So let me give you an example of what I mean. A few years ago, I worked with a congregation that had gone through a very divisive conflict in their recent past. And as part of that work, I learned that for many years prior to the conflict, most of the parishioners there tended not to engage in open disagreement. So instead, they preferred much more indirect modes of communication. Now, I'm from the South, so I understand. Like that's how we do it in the South, too. As a result, because they didn't really engage conflict directly or openly, differences among the church members were much harder to see. And therefore, no one recognized the range of perspectives that actually existed within the congregation. So they kind of all assumed, well, we're alike in these ways, we must be alike in these other ways. Because, see, they'd never talked about those other ways, really. So I was talking to one person who had been a member of this church, and she was reflecting on the period of tension leading up to the act of conflict. And she said, these are her words, "Throughout this whole thing, we kept our thoughts to ourselves and felt as though that was the respectful way to go. I am now kicking myself that I didn't find my voice earlier, so that perhaps other people would have known that there was another opinion." So from a very practical standpoint, telling the truth about difference matters, because if we don't, we may convince ourselves that the community we're part of is much more like-minded than we think, or than it really is. And if we labor under that illusion for too long, then we're often very unpleasantly surprised by the differences, which have always been there, right? When they come to the surface, suddenly we're shocked. I remember very well, a member of my own congregation, when we were going through a conflict, said to me, "You know, I've been going to church with her for 30 years, and I never knew she thought that." And I thought, that's sad. You know, like you didn't actually really know each other. You thought you did, but you, as a congregation, didn't talk about some of the important things that mattered. And so then when the differences emerged in the midst of a conflict, it felt extremely jarring to them. We might be able to avoid some of these surprises, I think, if we help communities that we're part of to practice surfacing differences that are already present. It's usually best to do this kind of work when the emotional intensity of the group is low and no pressing decision needs to be made. So part of the problem is when the difference surfaces in the midst of a big conflict or a big issue that's got to be resolved, people are much more emotionally wrought up and reactive. If we could work on, practice this skill in times of relative calm, just as a spiritual practice, even if you want to think of it that way, a discipline of surfacing differences all the time so that we're more used to it, right, in more low-stakes situations. So here's a couple of examples of what this could look like. Surfacing the differences in a group, of course, could take a lot of forms. One of them that I've suggested here is holding small group discussions focused around something like a denomination statement of faith or a specific community's mission or vision statement, right? We spend a lot of time on these things often when we're trying to create the mission or vision statement, I've found in organizations, but we don't often come back to them on a regular basis and kind of have conversation about, like, well, how are we thinking about this now? Or in terms of a denominational statement of faith, I think it could be really interesting to gather people and say, hey, you've been in this denomination since birth. You just joined it 2 years ago. You've been here for 20 years. Like, what are the different perspectives we're bringing to this? How do we each interpret this? And that actually helps people practice noticing the differences between themselves and their neighbor, but it doesn't feel fraught, right? It's just a conversation. You're not trying to make a decision. You don't have to be on a side. You're just talking about something and noticing what happens. I do think people already do this a lot of times in Bible study settings, when people are talking about scripture and they have different interpretations. So this is not to say that people aren't already finding ways of doing this, but these are a couple of other suggestions. And the reason I like this approach is because it's a way of inviting conversation rather than debate. So the purpose here isn't winning. It's not trying to get your perspective to be the one that wins the day. It's more just like, let's have a discussion about this, and let's get to know each other more deeply on a level that matters, something that's really important to us. Another opportunity, or a possibility I put there, is regular opportunities for people to share their differences in background, viewpoint, theology, et cetera, in relatively low-stakes situations. So, any small group meeting that you have, whether it's your session, your deacons, whatever group that you meet with, you could start each meeting by asking people to share something in response to a prompt. Like, what was your elementary school experience like? I mean, that seems like a pretty, kind of basic question, but you might discover a lot of really interesting differences among you. Or, what's the most interesting place you've ever traveled to? Again, these are, I think they serve as more than icebreakers. They serve as a way for people to share something about their lives that then people can start to notice, oh, that person has a really different background than I do. Or hey, how long have you been in our denomination? That might tell you that this person grew up Baptist and now they're Presbyterian. Or this person's Presbyterian since birth. And there's, it's interesting. It's not something that you have to fight about, but it's just a way to get to know each other better. And I think these kinds of discussions have the potential to help members of a faith community in very small ways begin to notice the differences among them in a way that feels comfortable rather than fraught. So then maybe they wouldn't be so surprised when they get to a more intense conversation or a more important issue and say, oh yeah, well, it makes sense that we don't all agree on this because we all have different backgrounds. So that's just a couple of ideas there for surfacing difference. I'm going to keep on going. We'll have some time for questions and conversation at the end. But the next area of practice is grieving and lamenting. So as we've just talked about, truth-telling in a very general way focuses on the facts of what happened or on the very real differences that exist among a group of people. By contrast, grief and lament are ways to tell the truth about how a particular situation or event has affected a person or a community. Grief refers to the many different ways people respond to a significant loss. Lament has a more specific meaning. To lament is to cry out to God in protest against the intense suffering one is experiencing. So whenever a faith community goes through an intense conflict or period of tension, there are likely to be a lot of different ways that people within that community experience loss. They may feel the loss of what they previously saw as a safe, comforting environment. They may lose closeness with others or even lose relationships altogether. Or they may simply experience the loss that comes with any kind of major change within a community. So in order to cope with these multifaceted aspects of loss, communities will likely need to do these three things I'm suggesting. Establish shared spaces for grieving, listen to one another's grief, and contain grief through ritual. And I'll walk through a few examples of what these might look like. So establishing shared spaces for grieving, one possibility there is to create communal spaces to share grief, both in worship and beyond. So in worship, we could talk about grief and loss much more often than we do. We don't have to wait for an event to happen to talk about it. We could make expressions of grief or prayers for the grieving more part of our regular services. There are also special services people sometimes create to try to give voice to that. So Blue Christmas or Longest Night services around Advent is one way that a lot of people do that. Also, you could create a special kind of gathering if it was in response to something specific. So one pastor I know convened something she called a healing meeting, so to try to just give a space for people to express that grief and to bring their sense of loss and talk about it together in a way that felt helpful to them. Another suggestion is to incorporate lament into the regular cycle of the community's liturgical life. You might not be surprised to learn that in the worship and prayer resources across denominations, the lament psalms are the least used psalms in worship. They're the least represented in those resources. And I think it's because lament feels hard. It feels difficult sometimes to say, God, why is this happening? To say that out loud in worship, or God, I'm really angry at you right now, which is kind of what those Psalms are expressing. But if we had that as a more regular part of our life together, it might become easier to lean on that in times when we really need it. The second idea I have is listening to each other's grief. And these are not all completely separate from each other. They definitely overlap in certain ways. But one possibility there is to provide opportunities for community members to listen to each other's stories of grief and loss. This is one of those places where someone with special skills may be needed to help facilitate that. The leader who's there all the time may not feel they have that skill, and that's okay, but creating a space for that can be helpful. Also, it's important to resist trying to create one unified narrative of the grief and loss the community has suffered, because it's a group of people. It's a diverse, body, and so therefore everybody's not going to experience it the same way. And that's part of the benefit, I believe, of creating a space for people to express what they're experiencing, because they will hear, again, differences emerge from the group in terms of some people are going to be devastated by what happened. Other people may be sad, but it's not affecting them in exactly the same way. And that's important for people to understand. Finally, containing grief through ritual. We can create special times and places for ritualizing grief and lament. For example, a retreat or a special service. I read about a woman who was a youth director, and she created a retreat for her teenagers right after the pandemic, and the focus was them grieving the losses they had experienced during that time. And it was a very healing experience for them. Developing versatile rituals that can be practiced communally, but also individually with families at home. So the pastor who was leading the congregation I mentioned, who had a very divisive conflict, she wrote a special prayer for people to pray. They used it in worship a couple of times, but it really became more a prayer that people were invited to use in their individual devotional time. And it was actually a prayer of blessing for the people who had left. And there were people in the congregation who said, I'm not ready to pray this, Pastor. She said, that's okay. I'm going to pray it for us, but when you feel ready, you can use this. She called it the Godspeed prayer, and it was offering the people who had left into God's hands and trusting that God would be walking with them. So it was really beautiful, and it also, I think, was very healing for the people in that church. Grieving and lamenting are steps, I think, that congregations really often try to skip over because it feels uncomfortable, but I think they're really necessary for healing and reconciling relationships. So I'll move now to confessing and repenting. As we've just discussed, lament leads us to name honestly the brokenness of the world and to cry out to God for relief, but it might also lead us to recognize that we're being called to do something to contribute to the world's healing. In some of the literature I explored in my research, this was often framed as a call for confession and repentance and for pursuing justice before true reconciliation can begin. And that's because true reconciliation can never come from covering over wounds and pretending they didn't happen, or from resisting the call to confession and repentance because we don't want to dwell in the past. The fact is, when we refuse to take responsibility for the ways we've perpetrated harm in the name of some superficial unity or harmony, we actually diminish the potential for and the power of authentic reconciliation. So to put it in terms of our lives together in community, confessing and repenting involves naming how we may have contributed to relational rupture and turning away from our tendencies to perpetrate harm, both as individuals and as faith communities. In communal conflicts, as I was saying earlier, it's almost never the case that only one person or group is responsible for all of the relational damage. This means that we all need to be willing to confront the real pain and suffering of others and admit the part that we may have played in creating it, wittingly or not. So, oops, I went to the wrong one. So, confessing and repenting, some examples of how this might look in practice. I think we all understand the idea of confessing and repenting when it comes to our own personal, interior spiritual life, confessing to God, or even confessing to another person when we've done something wrong and we want to reconcile that relationship. But thinking about it in a communal way might feel a little bit more challenging. So a couple of options here are, of course, communal worship settings. Many of us already do this in a general way, right? We have prayers of confession and repentance in our worship services. But we could create prayers for very specific situations if that felt appropriate. We can also create rituals that symbolize taking responsibility for the harms we may have caused. We could even have special services focused on confession and repentance if that seemed like it was needed in a particular community. There also is the possibility that I have read about. I have never done this myself, but people do sometimes have facilitated conversations or meetings where all the participants are invited to name their own part in a communal conflict and ask the group for forgiveness. And that kind of shows that responsibility is shared by everyone. Again, the group has to be kind of probably in a certain place before they would be ready to do that. But it could be something that really helps free people from the burden of whatever guilt they might be feeling or responsibility. And it also models accountability, right, which is really important. The last area of practice that I talk about in the book is, I call it blessing and releasing. So once we've told the truth about the relational brokenness in our communities of faith, and we've lamented that brokenness and confessed and repented of our own part in creating it, then we might be ready to focus on how to navigate our communal relationships going forward. However, even if a broken relationship can be healed, it's never going to be restored exactly to what it was before. So what does it take to move from a place of being honest about what has gone wrong in a relationship or community into imagining what the future will hold? One way to think about this is through the concept of blessing. We usually think of blessing as something we offer to people before they depart to go on their way somewhere else, right? Like the blessings we offer at the end of a worship service, or a blessing we pray over someone before they go off to college or embark on a faraway journey. But what if we began to think of blessing as something more expansive, as something we can offer each other in the context of community anytime we are faced with the challenge of stepping into a place of uncertainty? In his book, Deeply Woven Roots, faith and health expert Gary Gunderson includes a whole chapter on blessing, which he describes as a practice that sets people free to change, to untangle from their bondage, and to move forward into an unknown future. According to Gunderson, blessing is marked by two distinguishing characteristics. First, it pulls our attention to what is next, rather than getting stuck in what can no longer be changed. Second, blessing is honest. It tells the truth about death and loss and brokenness, but it does not allow those things to have the last word. In the context of communal conflict, blessing might point the way toward renewing our relationships and figuring out what our future together may hold. In this respect, blessing may look a lot like what we usually think of as forgiveness. We name the hurt we have suffered at another's hands, but we do not allow that hurt to be the only defining feature of our relationship going forward. And yet, forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. One can forgive another for harm that has been inflicted, but still choose not to continue in relationship with that person or group of people. This idea of releasing a relationship probably makes sense to us when we're thinking of it in interpersonal terms. But what about the situation we're focusing on here? Divisive conflict in faith communities. I think we would all agree that the ideal outcome for a conflicted congregation would be to find ways to heal the ruptures that have emerged and to embrace a renewed future together. But sometimes this doesn't seem feasible. Sometimes the problem at hand is just too big, or the polarization in the group is too strong. Sometimes the emotional intensity is too high, and it would take more time and energy to keep the body intact than really is available. In situations like this, people often begin leaving the community, and more often than not, they don't return. So what then? If true communal reconciliation doesn't seem possible, what should the goal be? Well, I've come to believe that while keeping a community together is a very worthy goal, and I do think it is the ideal, there may be even more important goal, and that is discerning together where God may be calling us, even if that includes the possibility of parting ways. I certainly would not advocate for taking a decision like that lightly, but I can now see how the choice to release relationships might in some circumstances be the most faithful step a community could take. It seems to me that the problem with the way most of our faith communities decide to take this step is that it's usually reactive, right? It's usually a decision made out of anger or frustration without engaging in the practice of prayerful discernment. So what if we started imagining the decision to stay together or to part ways as something we agreed to discern together over a long period of time, rather than something we vote on in the heat of the moment? I'm not saying a decision to part ways would then be easy or that it wouldn't leave pain and grief in its wake, but I have a hunch that healing might come more quickly if the decision were made together with deep respect for one another's differences rather than an angry reaction to them. So in the context of releasing relationships and parting ways, blessing starts to take on a slightly different meaning. It would still involve sending people into an unknown future, but it would assume that our futures will now diverge. It would be more like the traditional way we think of blessing, asking God's protection and accompaniment for someone who's now going to follow their own path, a path that's different from our own. So some examples of blessing and releasing. I have here practices of communal discernment. So here it might be helpful just to reflect, to think about ways that your faith community currently practices discernment in relation to decision making. What would it look like to use similar practices to make decisions about how to engage conflict or how to renew or even release relationships? Another possibility is ritual practices of blessing and releasing. So you can imagine a faith community engaging in a ritual of recommitment to one another following a period of conflict or tension. So that would be if they've decided to renew their relationships. Or you could imagine them ritualizing their release of one another from their covenant promises if they decide to part ways. And again, communities are going to have to be in a kind of certain place to be able to practice some of these things, especially if they choose to release. But I just think the way we've been doing our releasing lately is not the most helpful. So I know that I've only begun to scratch the surface of these areas of practice, and there's so much more we could discuss about each one of them. For now, though, I'm hoping this will provide some helpful food for thought as we all think about the communities we're a part of and what kind of reconciling practices might be most important in those settings right now. My prayer is that each one of us will leave this place today with stronger hope in the possibility of reconciliation, trusting that God is already making all things new. Thank you. So I think we do have a few minutes for questions because I believe the next presentation doesn't start till 10, so we could probably take a few minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk.
You're welcome.
You spoke about surfacing differences continually, like
Yeah.
being that a continual practice. So I wonder what you might suggest for a community whose coping mechanism with past trauma has been to really, plunge difference beneath the surface.
Right.
So and even thinking about it talking about it in a positive way. Oh, we don't talk about those things because we want to
Right.
be, and not just like, oh, you're a Baptist and I'm
Right.
a Presbyterian, but
Right.
some of those more maybe fiery topics. So how does that, if that's become sort of a value of hiding difference, even if they don't think of it like a negative thing, how does that then resurfacing practice? How does that look?
Yeah, I do think this becomes more challenging if the community does have something like that, something traumatic in their past that makes them very, very averse to any kind of difference or conflict. So there, I think the key would probably be starting as small as you can, just talking about very kind of basic, like innocuous differences that don't have emotional weight. So, when you read about like how to manage conflict or how to help people engage in difficult conversations, one of the key tenets is you don't start with the hardest thing. You don't just jump right in a group and say, what do you think about immigration? Something like that. You have to build trust and rapport in the group. So I actually think this is serving two purposes. It's helping surface some small differences that hopefully don't feel too fraught, but it's actually building trust and rapport in the group. So that people can begin to trust each other at a deeper level, become a little bit more vulnerable, and share something that's important to them, right? And hopefully help them learn something about their neighbors. Because the other thing we know about conflict is when people have more what they call cross-cutting relationships in a group. So relationships that go across different kinds of subgroups in the community, they tend to handle conflict better because they think, oh, well, we're really different politically, but hey, I served with you on that mission trip to Nicaragua, and we really got to know each other, and so perhaps I'm willing to give you more benefit of the doubt, right? So surfacing those differences in a kind of more low stakes way, even if they're very small, I think can help people to learn about each other and also form bonds. So like, oh, you grew up in Virginia, I grew up in Virginia, and that kind of like creates a little bit of affinity that I think can help maybe take some of the intensity out later. But a lot of this, I think, is about building very small skills over time that then help people cope with things that feel more threatening later. It's not an easy task, I know, in a place that is just really, really averse to it. But I think it can build, kind of like building a muscle, building muscle over time and then using it later on. Thank you for the question.
I'm going to throw an observation out, but I really have a question. The observation is that there's so many trigger words anymore. The conversation is so loaded with a minefield.
Right.
But the question I have is, you mentioned a couple of times the word rituals. Could you give some examples of rituals for the use of healing?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of different possibilities out there, and I'm certainly not a ritual expert, but one of the things that we do know, I think, about humans is that rituals are really important to us, right? Think of the effect it had on people in the pandemic when they were not able to participate in the major rituals of life, graduations, weddings, all those things. Rituals are important to us as humans because they help us create meaning. So one ritual that I read about in the Book of Forgiving, which was written by Desmond Tutu and his daughter, was basically that idea of renewing or releasing a relationship. So they suggested a stone ritual, and I think you could do this as an individual or a group. You go out into nature, you find a stone, and that stone represents your relationship with the person or the group, maybe, that you're currently trying to reconcile with. If you decide that you need to release that relationship, you go and you find another place for it. Like maybe you throw it into the brook, or maybe you put it into your garden. But if you decide to renew that relationship, you can give it to that person and have a conversation about how we're going to renew this relationship. For a group, you can imagine everybody bringing their stones, right? If the community decides to stay together, we all bring our stones. And this is like a symbol of our commitment. So that seems like a very simple thing, but you would be surprised by how things like that can be helpful. Similarly, people can ritualize their grief by doing things that are embodied, right? So, you think about like in weddings, sometimes people light a candle together or something like that. You can imagine ways that different groups could creatively think about how do we want to symbolize, whether it's our commitment to each other, our desire for healing. You might do it at the beginning of a process of healing and reconciliation to symbolize commitment, and then you might have a different ritual at the end. But I think it doesn't have to be any specific thing. It needs to be whatever is meaningful to the community. And there's tons of examples out there you could probably find, but I actually think it's most effective when people decide together what they want to do and what meaning it has for them. There was one right here, I think, Michael, or Bobby. Thank you.
Yes, it's a question and sort of asking advice. I'm currently in the Methodist Church, United Methodist, but I am a very conservative, believing in the Bible as inerrant Word of God, and got along fine and still get along fine in the Methodist Church. But now, because of the divide there that's just happened, and I don't want to, and I'm now attending because my background, I started out Presbyterian, been an Assembly of God pastor for several years, been a United Methodist pastor for several years. Now I'm going back to a Pentecostal church that is very conservative and believes in biblical inerrancy. But they're having a problem where they might be just going too far. And I don't want to bring any divisions.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to do what I've done and I still get along fine in any one of those denominations by what Wesley did, saying, though we may not think alike, can we not love alike? But then people are asking me, what do you think about this? And they're just doing a Bible study about something that
Right.
I find problems with.
Yes.
But yet, I find that the people teaching it are uncomfortable when I bring up biblical, and I can give them biblical answers. Can you give me some advice?
That's a really tricky situation. And I think what you're describing is actually not uncommon in churches. Yeah. Oh, I understand. Part of the trouble is, I think, human nature. That human nature, we are wired as humans to feel most comfortable when we're like people that we interpret as like ourselves in certain ways. Now, this can translate, racially, socially, all different ways. But sometimes in the church, it happens around theology, right? That we feel most comfortable when we all are kind of agreed on theology and what the Bible means. Well, as you know, the problem is, even if it seems like we all agree, we probably actually don't, So the challenge for you as the leader is to decide, how much can I share of a different perspective without it being interpreted as, debating or trying to, deny other people's perspectives. I think part of the task there is to try to create an environment where different people can actually share other perspectives and have that be held by the group. But I think that could take time. And it is important to know that if you were the pastor of the group, or you're not the pastor of the group, okay. Well, I think it's a little bit easier in that respect, because you're not the one that's the leader that, my word goes, like that people might be thinking that's how you're presenting it. But even as a member of the group, I do think it is helpful for a group to have different perspectives, and a group is actually more healthy when it can contain diversity of perspective without losing the love, like you talked about.
Can we still share our differences?
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying, without offending. I say, I feel
Yep.
better than you.
Yeah,
You do that.
yeah, you do that. I mean, I think that's probably, in some ways, unique to the particular group. It sounds like, from what you've described, this group has a hard time hearing other perspectives. I can see the dilemma that you're in. If it were me, I would probably feel like I wanted to share some different perspectives from time to time, just because that's more honest. It would be hard for me personally to participate in a Bible study if I felt I could never say what I truly thought. It's sort of like when I have students in the classroom. If I have a student in my class who feels they can't say what they actually think, that's a problem for the class, because it's not creating the environment that I'm hoping to create. So it may be that, you could continue to try to do it. You might also think about having a conversation with whoever's facilitating and saying, hey, I would really like to share my own perspective sometimes, and I wonder if you feel that's welcome. It might just help the leader be thinking about, maybe I need to find other ways to help us have conversation. But I don't know the particular group, so I can't give you much more specific advice than that, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, one more question here. I think we have time for one more.
I wonder if you could say a little bit about the difference between peace as an absence of any sort of disturbance and real peacemaking, because I hear that here. I'm thinking about your holding people accountable to threats.
Yep.
And that sometimes feels very discomforting to people,
Yes.
and they don't like that.
Yeah, you're right. A candidate for our doctor ministry program I interviewed recently talked about the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking. And I think that's an important distinction. So a lot of times I think we keep the peace in congregations by just not saying what we really think or avoiding difficult topics. But the truth is the differences are still there. So I think what you're describing, Joe, is more like making peace by engaging the differences honestly, but also holding people accountable and having boundaries. One thing I think is very interesting is sometimes when I've talked even in lectures or different things about hospitality, people say, well, doesn't hospitality just mean you welcome everybody? And I'm saying, yeah, it doesn't mean you welcome all behaviors, though. So, if I invite someone to my house for dinner and they hit my kid or kick my dog, that's not okay with me, and I'm going to say that to them, and we're going to have to work that out. So similarly, I think in the church, sometimes we have this idea of we have to welcome everybody and tolerate everything. And I don't think that's so. I think churches, faith communities, should be thinking very seriously about what are our expectations for how we engage each other here. And it doesn't mean that we're going to kick you out the first time you make a mistake, but it does mean that we're going to be clear, like this is who we are, this is what we expect. And if this doesn't seem like the right fit between us, there are many other parts of the body of Christ that person might find a more helpful relationship with. I think sometimes we're so anxious to bring people in that we don't stop to think about what are the behaviors or the attitudes or the postures that we actually want to cultivate and help people to do that by being clear and honest. Thank you for the question. I think we're out of time, but I'll hang around for a few minutes as we transition, and thank you so much again for your participation and your interest today.